Welcome to this greatest hits album curating the digital watches of the 80s. I'll be your DJ, that is, digital watch journey partner, for this Now That's What I Call Digital Watches compilation that draws together all the different flavours of the 80s, from the sporty jock watches, the geeky techie watches, to the watches adorning the wrist of the yuppie brigade. There might even be some two-tone. Although this video is far from comprehensive, for that, look into my individual watch brand deep dives, it will give you a good immersion into all the amazing branches of this less illuminated side of watch history if you're new, and for those already invested, I reckon I've got a few in here that slipped your radar. Let's put side A of the cassette into the Walkman and press play on that first track. Citizen pioneered the highly sought-after status symbol that is the mighty alarm in the 70s, with its ultimate offering in this space being the 1980 Citizen multi-alarm World. But as time moved on, this was not enough for your budding, young, upwardly mobile professional, with Orient in 1979 bringing the first melody alarm, with Seiko following shortly afterwards with the Melodia. But it would be Casio in 1980 with the omnipresent Module 82 that would release a broad range of watches with lovely chirping melodies. Hong Kong would pump out melody alarms that would be rebadged by multiple different brands, like Bradley with the Star Wars melody alarm. There were some mainstream manufacturers still clinging on to some presence in the early 80s, which would all pretty much have a melody alarm available, like Armatron, Timex, Bolivar under their Caravelle brand, and Trafalgar. One of my favourites is the Xeon James Bond watch, complete with long James Bond theme melody. Very cool. Casio would be one of the few to try and push a little bit more on the alarm sphere in the 80s with the Casio Melody 30 and the boombox styled Wake Up alarm. But one I do think is a little different is Orient's 75100 memory alarm with dot matrix display. Another avenue to the alarm is the talking watch with Trafalgar's 1200 talking watch in 1981, the Seiko Y823 and the 1986 Micronta Vox watch. Although beloved by many collectors, these old early 80s melody alarms are now often put into the 80s novelty trash bucket. And oh, how the alarm style has fallen from the status symbol it was in the 70s with Citizen. Digital watches were already hitting a stage in the late 70s and early 80s of being cheaply made, with most of the US and Swiss manufacturers leaving the market for production of digital modules, with huge scale production taking place in the Far East. Their prestige factor had faded a bit. One approach to keep people interested who didn't want to advertise the fact they were wearing a digital watch, but they still enjoyed the ease of a digital display, was to provide the best of both worlds in one. And it was Citizen in 1978 that led the way with the Digi Anna 8900, with Seiko following shortly behind. Although the Omega Chrono Quartz in 1976 had some of the elements of digital and analog too, but we're here for the 80s. Citizen would continue to be a big force in the Anadigi area with the 8911 and 8920, with Seiko continuing too with the H249 and H259. They would provide an Anadigi option with their more affordable Alba and Pulsar range too, with the Y651, which would be branded as Dimension 2. To establish the fully cool factor of the Anadigi, James Bond would wear a H357 in For Your Eyes Only, with Formula 1 being the other area used to establish coolness, with Nelson Piquet wearing a Citizen Digi Anna 419818 when winning the F1 championship in 1981. Upping the funky factor, we would see some more elaborate Anadigis come from Citizen, like the 8943 Robot and 8970 Mickey, with Seiko joining the dots back to their diving watch catalogue with the H558, which we now call the Arnie due to Arnold Schwarzenegger famously wearing it in Predator, amongst many other films from the 80s. Other Japanese brands would have horses in the game of Anadigi, with standout for me being Ricoh's side-by-side model in the Ricoh 140 range, with US Norwegian favourite Timex having the 1989 Timex Marlin Digital. The Swiss would be in the game too. They were clinging on at this point with some more basic looking things from their brands like Longines and the Tissot 2 timer, but to give them their credit, they made three totally epic Anadigis in the 80s. The first was the 1981 Omega Equinox, which took a different slant on the Anadigi by having a reversible face, JLC Reverso style, and in true 80s form, it was available in two-tone. It's one of my favourite watches of all time. The second, also from Omega, was the Omega Seamaster Multifunction, an early ancestor of the later legendary space watch, the X33. Finally was the Breitling Aerospace, earlier branded as Navitimer, which brought Anadigi to the pilot watch sphere. Just using twisted pneumatic display LCD technology to display digits was an underuse of their technology, so in true 80s style, we had to do more. The most obvious place to start was a digital version of analog hands, which actually started in the 70s with Sun Crux and Texas Instruments, but the 80s is where it more fully came into the mainstream. One of the earliest and most iconic is Casio's Module 103, which was used in the fan-favourite reference AA85, featured in the film Blue Thunder. The 1982 Casio AX1 with Module 118 is their classic pseudo-analog reference. Citizen would also branch out from its digi-analine to a full pseudo-analog with the 9560, and a cool take on the concept was Orient's Sound Monitor, a lesser well-known part of their back catalogue. One of the most famous examples is the Seiko G757, available in many variants across both the Sports 100 and Silver Wave range, but the most famous one is the one obviously worn by James Bond in Octopussy. Timex would get in on the game too with the Timex M433 Q Timex Liquid Crystal model, I believe from 1982, although the marketing for the recent reissue states it was 1987. I also love these Xeon 7 and 16 Melody Alarm Chrono pseudo-analogs. Some broader graphical elements had been used in analog watches with LCD elements, like the Citizen 8940 Time Track, with the seconds being displayed in segments around the outside. This concept would go full digital with the 1980 Casio Time Scan. More static LCD graphics would use double LCD technology, as we'd seen in the early Seiko World Map offerings, with a cool 80s version of this being in their Alba range with the Y951 and Y950, as well as in calendar models like the Casio Universal Calendar and dot matrix displays pioneered by Seiko. But the 80s was all about more dynamic use of graphical elements in displays, hi-fi style. This would start to be used in sportier styled watches like the 1985 Sport Windsurfer, with colourful elements in the 1988 Citizen colour graphics. One of the most sought after watches amongst the Casio vintage collectors are the Twin Graph and Twin Graph 2 from 1986 and 1988 respectively, and a favourite of the Japanese for some reason, with the referee timer with the Casio Soccer Timer 512 SW110 and the Citizen P120 DQ9115 referee timer. Other popular watches from this period with sub-dial graphical displays with the Trigraph TGW10 and TGW100 and DGW10. My favourite use of these graphical displays will be no surprise to long-time viewers, the Casio Moongraph and the Casio Cosmophase. It's been noted in the comments that I mention them occasionally. Although the world of plastic digital watches began in 1979 with the Casio F100, building on the long-standing work of Tissot with the Idea Research 2001 in analog land, it was the 80s where this came into full life. The other aspect that really started to become a prominent part of digital watchdom was combining this with water resistance and being marketed as a sports watch. The archetypal watch beginning this trend for me is using the Casio Module 106 within the Marlin W150 and W100 watches in 1980, and watches like the 1981 W20 with 50 meters, the W300 350 and W450 at 100 meters, and the iconic precursor to the G-Shock, the 1982 DW1000C Snorkeler. In the early days, they would even go crazy with a 300 meter water-resistant tank in 1985. Other brands would adopt similar general sporty water-resistant watches, with Citizen's 9500 and 9510, as well as their P110 and P100 with 200 meters water resistance. Orient had a pretty poor effort with the N2400, which is sadly around the time when they called time on the digital watch portion of their business. Brands would start to go more specialised with these watches due to their success, with emergence of new highly specific brands like the Freestyle Shark in 1981 targeted at surfers, with sublines within the Timex range in 1989, including the Wave Rider model, with a small capsule for holding the lip balm, and brands including things like Tide bezels with the Citizen P110, later a feature of watches like the Timex Reef Gear. The other significant branch of the sports digitals family tree in the 1980s is the jogging and running watches. Casio would set the pace here with the J100 Pace Runner, with the key feature being intermittent beeps that could help judge your timing. Citizen had its own pace offering with the CR3011 Pacer, as well as the D132 and D150 running watches. One of my favourites due to its graphical quirkiness and early adoption of dot matrix display was the Seiko D138, nicknamed the Big Running Man. Cycling is another area where there were some niche watches, and we have the targeted options there like the 1989 Velo Track and Citizen D130, 1930. Swimming, running, cycling, you can see where this is going. Now the multi-sports watch had been tried with things like the Casio Multisport, and Citizen had some multi-sport options too, but the hook that really got things going was the Triathlon. This was of course Timex's Triathlon watch, launched in 1984, with the range being expanded to include the Ironman Triathlon link in 1986, after some valiant marketing genius from the Timex team that attached themselves to that event. They would keep this ball rolling into 1985 with the Timex Atlantis 100, and from this point we're really at the races and competing with the likes of Casio in the digital watch market after some unsuccessful forays into the computer space with Sinclair. Although Casio tried to fend off this incursion with the lap memory watch SDB 300W, which I think looks super cool, the Timex Ironman range grew strong roots that continue to this day. Timex even offered another cool angle on the triathlon theme with the Tri-Pre in 1989, but it never caught on as much. Double-clicking into the water sports category, analog watches had the Regatta watch, so one of the last hurrahs of the homegrown digital modules from the Swiss was the 1982 Memo Sail with Regatta function, and this had 4 balls that disappeared to indicate the preparation for the start of races. I own one of these and I love it. Timex were even in the game with the 1989 Timex Victory, but one of the reasons I really wanted to bring in this genre was that the Seiko A827 yacht timer was their original deployment of the super cool rotary switch function where you could change function by twisting the bezel. Ingeniously linked to the yacht timing function, you will see the option to select different preset times around the bezel. It's this technology that would be used within one of my favourite watch families ever, the 1982 A829 Rotocall watch. Famously dubbed the astronaut due to its regular use in space, has personal choices due to the ease of changing function with gloves. This same ease was the rationale behind the technology's deployment in the Giugiaro-designed A828 Speedmaster LCD model in 1983, complete with slanted display to enable easy reading whilst driving, and an awesome example is the Seiko A826 training timer with an attached cable that could be used to start the timer, famously worn by Doc Emmett Brown in Back to the Future. Interestingly enough, I hadn't known that Casio actually did their own version of this tech with the 1986 Moto Sports 570 with rotary switch, but I haven't seen it used again. I kind of want one of these now. Winter sports is another area of digital sports watchdom that came online in the 80s, and you could partner your awesome 80s ski wear with the 1986 Casio 504 Winter Sports Digital, but surely any self-respecting yuppie would be rocking the mad 1987 Timex Skiathlon. Sadly, Seiko's best offering here was a mid-90s offering with the Ski Thermo watch, so I can't include it here, although whoops, I just did. Which leaves us with the last few random sports models. Casio, as would be an ongoing obsession that continues for them to this day, would have some fishing-focused watches with the Fish and Time in 1989. Timex would of course emulate this with their own hooks model, but they would go a little more 80s with their ladies' aerobics watch. Citizen were the original innovators in calculator watches, with one of my grails in 1977, with Seiko following with the C153, but in 1980 Casio would really bring it to the masses with the C80 and 801. When you think 80s digital watch, this or a variant of it is probably the first one that you'll think of. In the 80s, Seiko leveraged its more affordable Albert and Pulsar brands to launch a cool looking number, the Y739, complete with a stylus for pressing the keys, with an 80s Seiko branded model being the 1981 C439, and another nice one being the C515. Not the first, that was the National Semiconductor one in 1977, but Casio took scientific wrist calculators to the mainstream with the 1982 CFX20 and 201 scientific calculator watch. Amazingly enough, the touchscreen predated the 80s with the Omega 1640 sensor quartz, with Casio again jumping on the bandwagon in the 80s to bring this to calculator watches with the TC50 and TC500 touch sensor. A weirder application of this where you wrote on the analog screen was the Janus Calc touchscreen in 1984. Armatron's Wrist Comp 101 was another option in 1985, another one worn by Doc Emmett Brown in Back to the Future, amongst others in this video, with Armatron taking an interesting angle with the 1983 piano watch. And Timex even had some, like this 1989 84911. Another substantial development was the ability to store text and numbers in memory, which Seiko had largely kicked off in 1978 with the Memory Bank LC. In the 80s, Casio's first prominent deployment of this was the TE25 dictionary watch, watch. The 1982 Seiko D409 sign table is seriously cool and allowed the saving of data and displayed it in a dot matrix display, and it wouldn't be until 1984 that Casio would come out with a classic databank CD401, which in addition to the calculator function could store alphanumeric data points. Full-blown computer wristwatchery would largely be the domain of Seiko, with 1984's RC1000 and RC2000, 1985's RC4000, and the 1988 wristmac used by astronauts to exchange messages in space. The last nerdy one I'll mention is the 1982 Sharp-produced electrochromic displays for Seiko used in the ECD F623A. One of the digital watch history geeks, as I believe this is the only time this tech was ever deployed. Right, let's get down to the arcade. Entertainment from and novelty in digital watches is an important component of 80s digital watchery. One of the most 80s is the phenomenon of gaming watches, kicked off earlier with more casino-oriented options, but made more mainstream in the early 80s by Casio with the GM10 and 20, and many brands repackaging Hong Kong-based gaming modules like the 1981 Nelsonic Space Attackers watch. But whilst Casio was making more generic golf, basketball, pyramid and submarine games, and Albert and Orient released some other interesting choices, Nelsonic made a smart move and landed the license to Pac-Man in 1982 with the classic Pac-Man watch, which would carry over into Qbert, featured in Stranger Things, Frogger, and the Big Fish license Nintendo coming in 1989 with the Super Mario Bros. And Zelda gaming watches. The niche choices are the GCE Game Time watches and the Tomy Watchman game watches, but the mainstream inheritor of the Nelsonic age was Tiger Electronics, starting off with Hard Driving in 1989 with other classics like Double Dragon. The other novelty symbol of the 80s, the radio watch. Now these watches actually likely started in 1976 with companies like Asia International Electronics, with imported modules being repackaged by all sorts of folks. In the 80s this included Nelsonic, Sinclair, Sanyo with the R10P, Armatron, and the affordable sub-brand of Seiko that launched in the mid-80s, Laurus. One of the more interesting looking options due to the bold 80s colours was the 1985 D031 Citizen Soundwich. Fun novelties from Casio within related areas are their TM100 radio watch and their unique phone dialer, which would emit DTMF tones that can make phones dial pre-stored numbers. A related area is the phenomenon of voice recorder watches. The OG here was Seiko with the 1983 M516 voice recorder, famously worn in Ghostbusters, and my favourites are the Citizen options with the 1985 voice memo and the insanely cool VX2 Voice Master, the world's first watch with voice recognition. We move from radio and voice to TV, where there's only really one contender, the unique Seiko TV watch released in 1982 and featured in James Bond. This used a monochrome active matrix LCD on a silicon wafer and was around the time that we were seeing pocket televisions, for example, the Sony FD200 and FD20. Every girl crazy about it, shine as me. We run the risk of being overly focused on technological features, but of course, in the 80s, pure aesthetics and fashion was a large part of proceedings. One of the first elements where we see this is how thin the watches were, which was the battleground from the analog quartz sphere, and this carried over to digital watches. The 1980s Seiko F231 and F221 and the Casio Ultra Slim using module 436 give you a feel of some of the earlier slim models, but it's really with the 1985 DigiPaper FS series from Casio where we get crazy slim, with a whole portfolio of options including the FS10, FS20, FS023 and FS50. This would carry over to other kinds of watches like the CFS80 thin calculator watch, dot matrix with the FS12 and the FS52. But let's have a little tour of some of the more standard range that have some 80s flavour, with some select examples like the 1980 Casio F300, the Seiko A439 with front pushers. Bolivar had a limited digital range carrying over into the 80s with the Caravelle series, as well as Sanyo with the M200 and Orient with the Chronograph 8200. Seiko would launch its more basic, affordable range Laurus in 1982, with Citizen standard models from 1982 like the TP1004. The dress digital concept was something we saw in the 70s, with Timex bringing an 80s variant of this with the M147. An absolute classic that you see going for big value on eBay when they rarely come up is the Casio F15 from 1984, which just screams 80s, and ditto the F78W and F23W with their sporty styled straps, with the DW71, W59 and W58 being the other standard offerings that scratch that 80s vintage Casio itch. The era of solar watches started early in the 70s with the like of 1973's Real Electronics Synchronar 2100, with LCD solar starting in 1976 with the German company Crystallonic. Early 1980s options included Seiko's A557 and A628, with Casio finally entering the game in 1983 with the SA60G and Calculator Solar CL30. Seiko would utilize its sub-brands Alba and Laurus to launch the W192 Thin Digital, which predated the batteryless 1986 Casio using Module 520. Citizen, who was pioneering in the broader world of solar with eco-drive technology with super-thin solar cells, leveraged this technology in the DX80, with Sanyo's and Morton technology also being deployed here in their late 80s range, like the DS5002. The true era of the sensor watch on steroids is when we get into the 90s with the Casio Protreks and Alba Hypertechs of the world. But the building blocks of this technology begins in the early 80s with the icon that is the 1982 Digitemp from Citizen, which continues to reappear in new guises even today. Casio was hot on the heels with their own temperature watches like the 1982 TS1000 and TS2000 using Module 215, the 1984 TS1200 and 1989 TS100 World Time. Timex is offering in this space would be a little later in 1989 with the previously mentioned fishing watch called Hooks that had a temperature sensor that was also sometimes packaged as the Blazer brand. One of the other angles that intersects with the sports watch space is the pulse meter, with the early example of this being the 1982 S229 and the Super 80s S234 with chest strap, famously wore in Aliens, with Citizen having their own version with the D010 pulse meter in 1984 and later D110. And Casio came late to the party in 1987 with the JP100W pulse check. As you'll notice is somewhat of a theme here, and I find people are surprised at this, it was yet again Citizen who were the major innovators, with depth gauge sensor deployed first in the 1985 Aqualan C020, with the slightly less complex Casio depth gauge coming out in 1986. We start to introduce other elements of what would later become triple sensors with the 1988 Casio AltiDepth that used one pressure sensor to detect both altitude and depth, with the 1989 barometer watch just giving the raw pressure reading, which was intended to be useful for weather prediction. Some other weird and wonderfuls in this category from the 80s worth a mention are the light sensor in the 1982 Citizen Spectro, the UV sensor in the 1989 Casio UV Check, and the map meter that deployed a rolling wheel attached to the watch to translate distances from a map into real life.
When the going gets tough, the tough get going.
The final track is a crowd favourite and is of course Team Tough's mighty innovation in shock resistance, the 1983 G-Shock Square DW5000C, currently celebrating its 40th anniversary. This was a natural evolution of some of the watches in the sporty section we discussed earlier, like the Snorkeler. Some slightly lesser well-known variations are the 1983 Wide Temp LC that added improved temperature resistance into the mix, ostensibly to support winter sports activities, and the DW2000C Solar Heavy Duty in 1984, long before the Razeman. That watch was also available in titanium, which was deployed in a watch I rarely see mentioned, the TW7000. I think these look awesome. The introduction of mud-resistant buttons and adornment by Arnie in the Running Man didn't quite help the 1985 DW5500C G-Shock 2 replace the original G-Shock Square, but it still has its fans. The circular DW5400 also didn't quite have the same staying power. I see all the videos today accusing Timex of copying Casio's G-Shock line with the Command series, but naughty old Citizen was at it very early with the P130 in the 80s, that one of my subscribers calls the C-Shock. I do secretly want one though. A watch I'm very sad that doesn't exist today is the DW500, which was a smaller sized version of the Square, ideal for my skinny wrists, but you can't find anywhere in good condition, and you'd start to see the injection of the later colour craziness that would infuse the range with the 1988 Yellow G-Shock. They even snuck in an Anadigi in 1989 with the AW500. And that's the end of this greatest hits of the 80s. If you enjoyed this one, I reckon you would enjoy my longer term view on the development of digital watch technology through from their origins to today in the video on screen now. Do take a look, and if you enjoyed the video, please consider subscribing.